शारदे करुणानिधे सकलानवम्ब सदा जनान् शारदे करुणानिधे सकलानवम्ब सदा जनान् चारणादिमगीतवैभवपूरिताखिल दीक्तते 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 शारदे करुणानिधे सकलानवम्ब सदा जनान् परमभूषण भूषिते वररत्नमौळि विराजिते भर्मभूषण भूषिते वररत्नमौळि विराजिते शर्मदायिनि कर्ममोचनि निर्मलं कुरु मानसम् शर्मदायिनि कर्ममोचनि निर्मलं कुरु मानसम् शारदे करुणानिधे सकलानवम्ब सदा जनान् हस्तसन्धृत पुस्तकाक्षपटि सुधाघटमुद्रिके हस्तसन्धृत पुस्तकाक्षपटि सुधाघटमुद्रिके कस्तवस्ति वर्णने चतुरो नरकचरोऽथवा कस्तवस्ति वर्णने चतुरो नरकचरोऽथवा शारदे करुणानिधे सकलानवम्ब सदा जनान् चारणादिमगीतवैभवपूरिताखिल दीक्तते शारदे करुणानिधे शारदे करुणानिधे शारदे करुणानिधे
Welcome to this afternoon session of Namaste 2020, a global utsava of India's soft power, brought to you by the Center for Soft Power, with support from the Indian Council for Cultural Relations and the S. Vyasa deemed to be university. We are in our third weekend of programs, and the journey has been very enriching for us. We have learned a lot. And we have made a lot of connections, and a lot of the panelists have made their connections, and the participants have also, I think, enriched by this whole experience. We were wanting to do something with our heritage literature, our mantras, our Vedic chanting, and when we spoke to Dr. Shantala Hegde and requested her, I feel that there is a lot in our culture that is not known even by our own people, let alone the rest of the world. And in today's approach to science, because I believe that when we say science, it is a very systematic approach to any subject, which I think is an inherent part of our ethos in this country. But looking at it from an outsider's angle, they have a different approach to science. So we thought, why not we do something where the two will meet? And so came about mantra and neuroplasticity. And we welcome you, Dr. Shantala Hegde. I will now give it to Aparna to say a few words about you. Meanwhile, I would like to thank Aishwarya Srinivas, who rendered this wonderful opening. And what better opening than a composition of Sringeri Mahaswami on Sharade, who is, after all, the goddess of all learning and knowledge. Over to you, Aparna. Namaskar.
Thank you, Akal. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Shantala Hegde. She's an old friend of ours of the Center for Soft Power, a wonderful Hindustani musician and a very intellectual Indian scientist. Dr. Shantala Hegde is an associate professor of clinical neuropsychology. She is a consultant at Clinical Neuropsychology and Cognitive Neuroscience Center and the Neuro Rehabilitation and Faculty in Charge, Music Cognition Laboratory at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS, in Bangalore, India. She is a Wellcome Trust DBT Indian Alliance CPHI Intermediate Fellow and a Hindustani musician, as we mentioned. She's put together a wonderful session for us on mantras and neuroplasticity. Thank you, Dr. Shantala.
I would like to say here that Dr. B.N. Gangadhar, the head of NIMHANS, was to be with us today, but he has conveyed his best wishes and has let us know that he is delayed at another program. So thank you to Dr. Gangadhar also.
Thank you, Aparna ji, for that wonderful introduction. I'm humbled, and my many thanks to Center for Soft Power and Vijay Lakshmi ji for giving me this opportunity to kind of put together a thought that has been going on in my mind and in my scientific endeavor. And it was a wonderful experience for me to bring the experts together and make this particular program, which I hope will reach the audience, and the message is reached out to as many as possible around the globe. As you rightly mentioned, some of our ancient texts are rich with so much of knowledge, and it is scientific. Of course, the definition of science from one set of group to another, we need to kind of find the right chord and take the research forward. And so much of richness it has, and which can have application value, be it in our educational system or in our clinical domain. So in this particular program, I have brought together these kind of thoughts and how future research can be taken forward. So I look forward to the upcoming program and the feedback as well that we'll get from the audience. Thank you.
So I must say before we start that Dr. Shantala has put a lot of effort in getting experts from across the world to participate in this panel that she has put together. We felt that instead of bringing them all live, because many places the connections are not good, we had it recorded. Some of them are already there with us on the panel and some will be visiting the panel. So please be with us and let us all together understand the greatness of this heritage and culture.
ॐ भूर्भुवः सुवः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात् ॐ भूर्भुवः सुवः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्.
Namaste. What we heard just now was the Gayatri Mantra from the third mandala of the Rig Veda. What is very interesting is that this mantra was recited exactly the same way, with the same melodic contour, the swaras, the rhythmic contour, the chandas, as it was heard by the sage who heard it for the first time, and passed on from one generation to another through oral tradition of teaching and learning. Now, these are not just one mantras and two mantras that we know are there in the Vedas. The Rig Veda contains about 10,600 mantras. All the four Vedas, Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, Atharva Veda, taken together and excluding the overlapping mantras, the number increases by a few more thousand. What is interesting and perhaps mind-boggling is that people learned these mantras with the same pitch contour, the rhythmic contour, from one generation to another for these thousands of years. That's something fascinating. The very fact that this was taught by oral tradition and not by written text. There were other texts that followed with lesser stringent rules, perhaps, were the Aranyakas, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutra, and the Bhagavad-Gita. Nevertheless, the major method of teaching and learning was the oral tradition. And from a cognitive neuroscientist point of view, as a neuropsychologist, what really fascinates me is that how the brain, how this mind can actually learn these many texts exactly the same way and be able to recite this with the same pitch, the same rhythm, and with the same content. Now, we must also remember that these texts actually are rich with psychological principles, which could be like a gold mine for mental health professionals, because the higher goal of all these texts taken together is higher spiritual pursuit, to be able to achieve the supreme consciousness, so to say. So it's a gold mine. Some may agree, some may disagree about the very definition of science and how investigation, scientific endeavor should be taken forward in this field. Nevertheless, I strongly believe that the current cognitive neuroscience can actually understand more about the human brain itself, and also the benefits of learning these texts that were mentioned earlier on our physiology, on our psychological realm of functioning. I'm really grateful to Center for Soft Power, the Music Cognition Lab, NIMHANS, for bringing this program together and giving me an opportunity to make this happen. I'm extremely grateful to the experts who have agreed to be part of this program and who are here to share their knowledge, their scientific experience, as well as what they think should be the way forward. And I think that's a rich pointers for us to take this scientific endeavor forward. To begin with, we will listen to Professor R.L. Kashyap, an expert in Vedic texts, who has translated all the four Vedas into English. And he will take us through, perhaps he'll give us a bird's eye view on the very structure of the Vedas and take us through the oral tradition of teaching and training. So let's listen to Professor Kashyap.
Namaste to all of you who are seeing this program. Namaste is a word in the Rig Veda appearing in about 100 verses. Namaste is made up of two words, Namaha and Te. Te means all of you. Namaha, salutations. Salutations to all of you. I'm happy to say that this program is the source of this program is Dr. Shantala Hegde, professor in the NIMHANS. I am asked to talk about the educational value of our ancient, shall we say, revelations, the Vedas. Exactly this, what is the contribution of Vedas? First thing is, what are Vedas? Vedas are, in some sense, poetic verses of at least dated 6000 before the current era, BCE. Now you are in the 2020 CE current era. There is a reason for this date. It is done by, for example, Nicholas Kazanas, who basically said the Vedas are much prior to the what is known as the Indo-Saraswati civilization or the Harappa civilization, which is dated, of course, going to 7000 BCE. It doesn't matter. And so the point of this is, how did this ancient the mantras which are recited 6,000, 8,000 years ago come to our hand? Common sense would tell you, if they were all written in books, all of them would be destroyed because of the invasions we had. Our great universities, Takshashila, Nalanda, and all universities and books were destroyed by the Islamic invaders, and the British were also a part of it. So, the person who, Jean Limay, who passed away very recently, mentioned a very interesting thing. It's very interesting that the most fragile medium, the sound, has been able to preserve this ancient work much better than the so-called hard materials like writing, cathedrals, and that sort of thing. So as you see, sound, I make a word, it goes away. It is the most fragile thing. On the other hand, you take a pencil, write on a paper a line, it will go forever unless you burn this paper. So consider this the idea, the literate tension based on all of your ABCDs and that sort of thing, and the oral tension, they are the two ends of the extremes. And it is power of the oral tradition which has preserved this Veda. All of these Vedas, as I told you, basically we use the word Veda because later all of them were divided into four groups called Rig Veda, Ajur Veda, Sama Veda, Atharva Veda. In next to me, you see the entire text of the Rig Veda. Roughly, we divide the Rig Veda into 10 books called mandalas, and each book has, let me say, several poems or suktas, and each poem has several verses or stanzas. Therefore, when you want to refer to a mantra, you have to give three things: the mandala number, the sukta number, and the verse number. Sukta means sa plus ukta, that which is perfectly uttered. That is the idea of a sukta or a poem. So here we have this Rig Veda itself has about 10,500 mantras or verses, and all the four books combined. Rig Veda is next to me. It has only the text in the Devanagari script only, no commentaries and that sort of thing. Next to me also is the one volume of the Yajur Veda. It has text and our own English translation. And similarly, we have the Sama Veda and the Atharva Veda. And all the four together roughly has about 27,000 verses. I mean, there are many common things also. They are not all different. So, in some sense, we can say if you take out all the duplicates and that sort of thing, it may come to about 22,000. That is this idea. So, you may ask this question: to whom were it revealed? I use the word revelation. There were special people of wisdom and strength called as Ruchis in the ancient times. They led a what we call as a concentrated life all through what we call in modern times just 24 into 7. That is this idea. Not mere austerities. Of course, they had to eat food and do the little bit of sleep, etc. But still, they concentrated completely on the higher levels, and lo and behold, for some of them, thousands and thousands concentrated, among them for 400 of them. In some sense, they heard these verses. So these are called Shruti. Shruti means to hear. This is what we call as a revelation. What did they do? They transferred it to the memory side of their system, of their brain, and later they gave this to their disciples, who would get their disciples, and that's how it was preserved from direct contact to person to person to person. This is the oral tradition. All of you would say, oral tradition, oh, it automatically introduces errors. How do you know? No, thank you. Those people, the rishis, were not simply outer knowledge. They had knowledge and strength, number one. Number two, they had all the what we call foresight. They knew very well that errors could come. Therefore, in a modern times, some of you who know little engineering know what is called as the error correcting and detecting codes, which are used to preserve the correctness of all the things transmitted over your radio and TV and that sort of thing. These exactly were methods were used by the Vedic sages to make sure there is both error detection, some methods, and some automatic error correction. A person would recite it, and then that person, another person would say, "Hey, here is the error and the detection also." So you may wondering, how do you know all of this? As a matter of fact, my own teacher, Saligrama Krishna Ramachandra Rao, he passed away a few years ago. He said he himself learned the Brahma Sutra from his teacher, Vajjanatha Swami. They took the so-called Brahma Sutra, which is a 700 different small epigraphs. And he told Ramachandra Rao, "Look, do I have a book in my hand? No. Therefore, you can't have any book in your hand, a pen or pencil or paper. You simply hear to what I am saying. If you have any doubt, come tomorrow, ask the question, I will clarify it." This is what is called as the pure oral tradition. You may say, are there people who know all the four Vedas by memory? Of course, this acute doubt is not new. For example, when the Chinese visitor Fayan or Huan San came to India, they had the same doubt. Then finally, they were introduced to a person, Chaturvedi. He knows all of them, and he decided in their front. They had the books, and he didn't have any books. He decided, whatever some mantras you want, I will recite it from my memory. Therefore, this is how the Vedas were preserved correctly. And each Veda basically has only three tones, Udatta, normal music has about 7 tones called as Sa, Ri, Ga, Ma. Here it only called Udatta, Anudatta, Swarita. In the printed books they are marked, but in the oral, of course, there is no such thing as a marking. Therefore, that is there. For example, in the first month of the Rig Veda, we say Agnimile Purohitam Yajnasya Devam Rutvijam Hotaram Ratnadhatamam. This is the first verse of the Rig Veda. First mandala, first sukta, first verse. It is due to the idea of the deity Agni. That is the So the first thing you have to understand is these Vedas were not revealed to one person, no. They were revealed to more than 400. Among them, at least 30 to 40 were women. Very famous one also. For example, one lady by name Vak Ambrini She is considered as a teacher of the many Vedas, many later students in the great book Brihadaranyaka. I basically said there are only four Vedas: Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, Atharva Veda. Their date, as I told you, is earlier to 6000 BC. Later, of course, that was the period, high stream. Their creativity was very high. And that creativity was passed on from generation to generation. But everything else, the Rigveda recitation and that culture, came to sort of a partial end. There were other books called as the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads. These Upanishads are the end part of the Aranyakas. Now, when people speak of the Indian philosophy or Vedanta, they refer only to those books called Upanishads. And they say, of course, without any basis, because most of the Westerners or the Indians have never even bothered to look detail into the Rig Veda. They say there is there is rebellion of the Upanishad seers against the Rig Vedas. That is not true. If the point is, many of the famous verses quoted in the Upanishads, they themselves say they are from the Rig Veda. For example, consider the most common verses many of the Sanskrit walas know, like this two birds mantra, Dva Suparna Suyaja Sukhaya. Two birds are in a tree, enjoying the fruits, etc., looking at each other. This mantra is in the Mundaka Upanishad and also Shvetara Upanishad. But the original source of both of them is Rigveda, first mandala, 164th Sukta and 20th verse, 164.20. Similarly, you have heard of the Vivekananda's common idea. We are all children of the divinity, Amatasya Putraha, children of immortality. This also is in Shvetara Upanishad. What is the source? The source is the 10th mandala, 13th sukta, first mantra. Like this, I can give you a lot of examples quoted in my book of Upanishad. So, to say there was sort of rebellion of the Upanishad sages against the Rigveda sages is a complete falsehood. They completely carried out, but they expressed this idea in a different way. Rigveda, unfortunately or fortunately, is couched in a very symbolic language. That's the problem. Because they felt that is best. For example, you see, Westerners couldn't understand that the Veda, Sanskrit of the Veda, is quite different from the classical Sanskrit of the people they know, the 19th, 18th century Sanskrit. It is called as the later Sanskrit. For example, to give you an example of what happens, take the simple word cow. Ordinarily, cow means a cow, four-legged animal. But even people, youngsters know the top of a temple is called Gopura. You think there's a cow on the top of a temple? No. Again, for example, in the sort of a place where recitation is done, it's called Goshti. Is Goshti a place where cows are sold? No. So even ordinary people in Indian languages know go simply can't mean only the cow, it must have different meanings also. Therefore, this was what the great teacher Madhvacharya and later Sri Aurobindo noted, and they called each go as a ray of knowledge. Ray of knowledge endowed with strength and power to make sure. Similarly, Ashwa is not a four-legged animal. It is what we call as the vital energy. Soma is not simply a drink. It is what we call as the joy of work. When you do your work consciously, a joy drips into it. For most of us know that, and that is what is called Soma. Therefore, the problem in the Veda is, this understanding Veda is, unless you know this symbolism of the Veda, you really cannot go much deeper into it. Therefore, all the translations of Max Muller or R.T.H. Griffith and that sort of thing, they are exceedingly terrible because they didn't understand a deeper meaning at all. The first person in English who translated the mantras was Sri Aurobindo. Therefore, of the 10,000 verses of Rig Veda, he translated at least 3,000 of them, and in the period 1912 to 1950, and later, of course, things were different. Therefore, the point I am saying is, therefore, the question people ask, who already have told you the power. Therefore, the point is, the oral tradition is more powerful. And in India, exactly, we don't write our poems, our verses, poetry, on a pencil and a paper. There are a lot of very famous persons who automatically, spontaneously utter verses. In our own times, there was a lady called Bhimavva in Karnataka itself, who was basically a widow and, of course, illiterate. She did not know how to read, but from her mouth came out at least 20,000 verses on all topics, on everyday things, on metaphysical things, and everything. 20,000 verses. Therefore, the local head of the village understood this problem. Therefore, he put 1 or 2, 3 persons behind her. So whenever she took it down. That's how we have at least 10,000 of these her verses are there. That is Bhimava. Another example is the famous Sanskrit poet Vasishtha Gandapati Mani, who who recovered the great discovered the wisdom of Ramana Maharshi. He wrote his 1000 verse poem, Umasahasra, the same way, It simply came out of his mouth and 4 people took a dictation of it. That is how it came out of his mouth. Therefore, I tell people, what is the difference between writing and reading? I tell people, I know at least about 150 or 1 lines of the well-known songs to the various gods and deities. Of course, I didn't bother to learn them, but when I was studying, ladies in the house, they would recite it. It fell on my ears, and that's how I may remember them without anybody telling me. So I tell people, especially the ladies, if they only could bother to learn many of these, what do we call, the simple songs of every day when they are cooking or cleaning and that sort of thing, let it fall on the ears of the children. They don't have to tell the children, remember it, memorize it. They don't have to tell it at all. They will automatically do it. This is the power of the oral tradition, which is completely lacking in the so-called literary tradition. In the literary tradition, if you don't understand the page, you throw it away. That's the whole idea. And the idea again is the children automatically get this without your telling. Unlike the books, which the parents have to tell with the children, oh, read this book, they have to tell. So here is an example of that. I use the word chandas. Outwardly, there are basically about 12 main, it is called the meter. It is determined by the number of syllables in the particular verse. For example, Gayatri was meter has 24, Anushthabha 32, Trishthabha, for example, has 44. Therefore, this is only outward kasam. Chanda means chadayati, to cover. It uses this structure to, in some sense, give us a clue to the inner meaning. For example, the famous Ganapati mantra you recite, Gada Nam Tva Ganapatigam Havamahe. It is in a Trishtabh meter. The well-known Gayatri mantra, Tatsaviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Naha Prachodayat. This is Gayatri meter. Therefore, the idea is this, the chandas was designed so that the easily people could easily memorize them. I was asked, then I told them about the so-called Vedic error correction and detection methods. Therefore, normal way we sort of let us take our mantra like our Gayatri mantra, it may have about 10 words. What we do is we have another version called Gatha, Jana, that sort of thing, where we repeat these verses continuously. Words were so that therefore they give us a when you make a error, they give us a clue. They are called Vikritis, and the names are Gana, Jata, and Tapa. Therefore, these are also, how do you get it? By in some sense, we repeat the words in a systematic way to resemble, for example, a flag or a boat or a sort of a string, etc. They are the Gana, Jata, Tapa. Swara is very interesting. It is, I can't tell you in 2 minutes about that. The basic idea is that some sounds we take it up in pitch and some we get out in pitch and some neutral. For example, to give you an idea, example, Tat Savitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi. Here the Udatta upward is there. Bhargo Devas. You can't simply go on saying Bhargo, we can't say that. So there is a time limitation also. Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi. That. And Dhiyo. So after one, there is a down also. Therefore, Udatta, Anudatta, Swarita. And of course, I can't give you, but the introduction for it is in my small book called Samaveda. It gives you all the clarification for it. Thank you.
ॐ श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः हरिः ॐ धन्वनागा धन्वना धन्वनागा धन्वना धन्वनागा धन्वना धन्वनागा धन्वना गा धन्वना धन्वनागा गा धन्वनाजिमाजिन् धन्वनागा गा धन्वनाजिन् धन्वनाजिमाजिन् धन्वना धन्वनाजिन् जगेम जगेमाजिन् धन्वना धन्वनाजिन् जगेम आजिञ्जगेम जजेमाजिमाजिञ्जगेम धन्वना धन्वना जजेमाजिमाजिञ्जगेम धन्वना जजेम धन्वना धन्वना जगेम जगेम धन्वना दीव्रास्तीव्रा धन्वना जजेम जगेम धन्वना दीव्राः धन्वना दीव्रास्तीव्रा धन्वना धन्वना दीव्राः समदः समदस्तीव्रा धन्वना धन्वना दीव्राः समदः तीव्राः समदः समदस्तीव्राः समद्राः समदो जगेम जगेम समदस्तीव्रास्तीव्राः समदो जजेम समदो जगेम जगेम समदः समदो जजेम समद इति स मदः जजेमेति जजेम धनुःशत्रोर्धनुर्धनुःशत्रोरपकाममपकामकं शत्रोर्धनुर्धनुःशत्रोरपकामम् शत्रोरपकाममपकामकं शत्रोरपकामं कृणोति कृणोत्यपकामकं शत्रोरपकामं कृणोति.
What we heard just now was an example of the Ghana Pata. Professor Aril Kashyap in his lecture did mention about the different methods of teaching to make sure that there are no errors while learning the Vedic mantras. In fact, they are called as Ashtavikritis or 8 different sound patterns. So, for example, it's like learning an algorithm or learning sargams in music and make permutation combinations of that particular text. So, to give you an example, it could be letter 1, 2, 3 and make different patterns as 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 1, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, you're actually training your brain in such a way that perhaps even if you try, you would fail to make any mistakes. That's perhaps these different methods, the Ashtavikritis, are perhaps one of the unique methods of teaching the Vedic texts and the mantras. And definitely it would demand a lot of your cognitive processes from the current neuroscience jargons, such as attention, your working memory. That means be able to constantly process information from your long-term memory and be able to recite it. And yes, definitely all these mantras and anything repetitive can have some calming effect. So we do know mantras have a calming effect on the brain. And also in some schools of Vedic teaching methods do engage hand gestures to correspond with the pitch, that is the udatta, anudatta and swarita, so that the individual while learning corresponds these hand gestures with the pitch contour. And of course there is chandas, which one cannot manipulate with. From as a researcher in neuromusicology and understanding the musical features of this Vedic text, it's really interesting that it has pitch, it has rhythm, it has hand gestures. So engaging almost, our frontal functions, that we say higher cognitive functions, with the motor pathway, and has a calming effect on the brain. So it's not like emotionally arousing in that sense. What we know today from neuromusicological research is that music, unlike the earlier theories, is not something that engages only your right brain, and language is only for left. We do know that music can activate the whole brain, the entire brain, right, left, everything including. My guess is that's the same with the Vedic texts and a lot more. Of course, there is a wide gap and a lot more research that needs to be done. I'm really grateful to James Hartzell, who agreed to be part of this program, and he's going to take us through a landmark work that he and his team carried out on Vedic priests to understand the effect of having learned these texts, these thousands and thousands of mantras, on verbal memory, on their language functions, and also their visual system, because many a times what we learn, we also kind of visualize the whole processes. So let's listen to Dr. James Hartzell as he takes us through the scientific work that they carried out.
We published our study in Neuroimage, looking at the structure of Yajurveda Pundit brains compared to matched controls. And then in 2018, I wrote a blog piece for Scientific American after a training course where I talked about some of the aspects of the neuroimage study. Something that's bothered me a little bit is that many people have assumed from reading the blog piece that the neuroimage study actually provides proof of the so-called Sanskrit effect, which is definitely not the case. And the blog piece was an exploration of some ideas and some background around the actual study. So today I want to talk about the actual study, so people will get a better idea of what we did find and what we didn't find, and how that could lead to new research avenues. The research, I also just wanted to show the list of the many people who were involved in making this study happen. About 20 people directly, and then dozens of pundits helped us out, and of course the huge administrative staffs at each of the institutions where we did the work, without whom the project wouldn't have been possible. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The team recruited 21 professionally qualified Yajurveda pundits from government Vedic schools in the Delhi area. So these were not pundits who came from Vedic families, and therefore there was no genetic bias involved. And because about 95% of them graduate from this training, there's neither self-selection involved during the training process. The matched group were very similar participants from the NBRC, National Brain Research Center community, and a neighboring college, and they were all males, so they're matched for gender, matched for age range, multilingualism, i.e. how many languages they are masters of, all right-handed, all right eye dominant, and with very similar levels of education. To choose participants who are only right-handed and right eye dominant is that this increases the likelihood that their natural language processing in their brain is predominantly left hemisphere. If people are left-handed, it's more likely that it's possible that their language might be in their right hemisphere. And so similar for the eye dominance. So this would change the group analysis between the two groups. So if you ensure that everybody's right-handed and everybody's right eye dominant, the odds are very high that everybody will be left hemisphere language dominant. It's not 100% sure, but very likely. Scan the structure of the brains of the professional pundits and the match controls. And we conducted what's called a cross-sectional, or you could say intergroup analysis, where you compare the brain structure of the two groups. And the idea behind this kind of analysis and study design is to say, all right, if I take 21 people who are all very, very similar and have a particular skill, and 21 other people who are very, very similar to the first 21 and to each other, and yet don't have that particular skill, then we can analyze the differences between the two groups of brains. And if we see a difference, then it's quite likely that there's a relationship between the particular skill and the difference we see in the brain. It's not absolute proof, but it's the beginning, it's an intro to a research line which says, all right, if you see a difference between the two groups, okay, that's something very interesting, let's research that more. And the first slide is I've seen in Twitter and Instagram and Google and YouTube videos and recordings from media and interviews and so on, people think, oh, this study proved that there is such a thing as a Sanskrit effect. Well, that is completely wrong. A cross-sectional study cannot, intergroup studies cannot directly demonstrate whether the difference you see between the two groups is directly related to the skill or the practice that you're studying. It's an indication that it might be. And then you have to do more research, more scientific research to find out whether that's really the case. So this study did not prove that this plasticity is related to Sanskrit. It didn't prove that it's related to Vedic Sanskrit, and it didn't prove that it's related to Vedic mantras. What we found was really interesting, but you want to prove that, you've got to do quite a lot more scientific research. Scientific study like this, it's a very good idea to have an introductory hypothesis. And our hypothesis was that the intensive training, because it goes on over 7 years to 10 years, and practice from 7 to 8 hours a day of oral text memorization and recitation, which is what the Vedic Sanskrit tradition pundits do. This might correlate with neuroplasticity in brain regions and networks of the brain that we know are associated with human speech processing, so perception and digestion basically, and production, so also the thinking, verbal memory storage and retrieval, because obviously your what you know linguistically has to be in your brain somewhere. We all think that's the case, and how you recall it, and therefore also the control systems that you have in your brain for listening to speech, producing speech, accessing your memory, reproducing information on demand, those sorts of things. So this was the hypothesis that the intensive training and practice that the Yajurveda pundits do, if it's going to show plasticity, it'll probably show plasticity in those parts of the brain. Actual results. Something I highlighted in the blog piece is that the pundits as a group showed this really dramatic difference in the gray matter density of their right hippocampi compared to the controls. And we have a little video that I made of the graphic of that difference. So this is the right hippocampus, this is the left. There's a very small difference or increase, relative increase, but if you look at the right, it's not just a surface relative increase in the pundits. Look at how intense and dense that gray matter increase is. It's a very active field even today. It is definitely the case that we know, without a doubt, that you need your hippocampi to encode new information, so basically to create new memories. And there's pretty good evidence that you need it to retrieve memories. And something that the pundits are definitely doing is encoding and retrieving continuously. Even when they've fully memorized the text, they have to recall it and recite it. So they're constantly accessing the memory system for the text. Correction, the hippocampus is needed for encoding new experience and particularly new verbal memories. There are parts of the brain that can encode new motor memories, effectively learning how to do something. even if you're missing your hippocampus, but that's a different story. The other thing is that we were very struck by the fact that the right hippocampus showed this tremendous change, or difference rather, in the gray matter density, and the left not so much. And so this raises many questions about the difference between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. And remember, these guys are left hemisphere language dominant. And the right hippocampus is critical for right hemisphere memory function. And this, we'll talk about this in the next couple of slides, but basically you're dealing probably with sound patterns rather than sound meaning in terms of the words of the Yajurveda. And if you interview the Yajurveda pundits and their teachers, they'll tell you very clearly, and this perception, and they'll tell you very clearly that they don't really concentrate on the meaning of the words. This sounds a little bit strange, perhaps, but if you go back in the literature, Sanskrit literature, more than 2,000 years ago, the texts talk about this. They say that the pundits can recite the mantras perfectly, but they can't necessarily explain in any detail what the words mean, even if they're fluent in Sanskrit. It's Vedic Sanskrit, it's very old Sanskrit, and the focus is on getting the sound exact and getting the pronunciation exact and reproducing it exactly, not on analyzing the meaning, the depth of meaning. They're not writing commentaries on the Yajurveda. So it turns out, as we'll talk about, that the right hemisphere is very much involved in that process more than the left hemisphere. Showing the two of the figures from the paper, neuroimage paper. The left figure there shows, figure 1, shows a surface projection, I'll explain in a second, of the difference in gray matter density or volume of the pundits relative to the control. So all the areas that show that orange-red color there are the areas where the pundits showed more gray matter, effectively, a denser, slightly bigger volume of gray matter than the controls did. And there were basically almost no areas at all where the controls showed more than the pundits. And on the right side is a different measure, which is called a cortical thickness measure, which literally measures the thickness of the cortical rim where the gray matter is. And again, in two different statistical thresholds, you see similar, not exactly the same, but very dramatic differences in the cortical thickness. And I'll just show you first I want to say this. Even in current science, we don't know yet exactly what drives neuroplasticity. So we have a lot of theories, and there's some very good evidence from rodents and so on about the types of changes. But when we see an increase in the density of gray matter, as in figure 1, or when we see an increase in the thickness of the gray matter, as in figure 5, if you talk to everybody in the field today, in 2020, and say, all right, what does that difference actually show us? What is the gray matter density increase? What is it? What is the cortical thickness increase? What is it exactly cellularly in terms of the structure of the tissue? There's really just a huge amount of debate, and nobody actually has the answer yet. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because what we're dealing with here are images of the brain that are taken by the MRI scanner, and then we're working on the images, and we see the differences in the image. The differences are definitely there. But how they actually happened is still an open scientific question that needs a tremendous amount of research. Earlier, figure 1 shows a surface projection of the differences in gray matter density between the pundits and the controls. So here I'm going to show you a volumetric version of that same information. So this is the same information in figure 1, but not projected to the surface, but rather within the three-dimensional space of the structure of the brain. And I think you'll see that it's quite dramatic. There, for instance, is this really huge area in the anterior cingulate region, which you see in all of the contrasts. This is now, remember, sorry, that with the arrow, but this is the right hemisphere here, and this is the left hemisphere. And you see that the changes in the left hemisphere are very more surface, whereas the ones in the right hemisphere are quite a lot deeper. And there's a big area in the back here, which I'll talk about in a second, similar to meditation, and really, really large changes in the cerebellum, the back part of the brain, but we're not going to go into that today. That we published in the paper, and did not emphasize in the blog piece, and therefore has not been discussed in the media representations of this story, is that in the subcortical region, which is the region, subcortex, it's the lower part of the brain, as the brain stem goes down your spine, we found quite a dramatic difference in the reverse direction. So in the sense that the controls had more gray matter than the pundits. So suggesting that in these particular areas, it's called the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, the caudate, the putamen, and the thalamus. As an example, for instance, in the amygdala, people who have had post-traumatic stress disorder tend to have enlarged amygdala because it deals with the sort of fear reaction circuit. And people who do a lot of meditation tend to have a sort of reduced volume in their amygdala because the system works more efficiently and quietly and doesn't require so much neural energy. So it may be the case that these changes that we found in the subcortex are related to some sort of heightened efficiency of functioning in the pundit cognitive system. But in fact, we don't really know. We found it, we had to report it. It's very interesting. It raises a lot of really interesting questions and actually requires further analysis to know more detail about it, and then also further research. And here I'll just show you a short little video. It's a graphic again, and you can just see this, just the colors outline the different portions of the subcortex that are shown in the figure. And you see the density, the difference in density is quite large. So this really raised a lot of open questions that we haven't answered yet, but certainly shouldn't be ignored. It's not the case that if you do Yajurveda recitation for 7 years or 10 years, 7 to 8 hours a day, that your brain just gets bigger. No, some parts of it seem to increase in gray matter density and cortical thickness, and in the subcortex, some parts actually seem to get less big, or certainly less dense in terms of the gray matter. I think density is more correct because we didn't really try and find differences in volume. We found differences in density. I want to do a little bit more detailed look at the differences between the left hemisphere, greater than that of the controls. And remember, these differences are statistically tested, so they're real differences. They're not just a possibility. They actually show these differences. So in the left hemisphere, we show a big difference here in what's called the superior temporal plane, and we think that's related to the phonemic processing of the phonemes of the recitation itself. There's definitely some verbal memory recall processing going on here. There's a lot of upper parietal region stuff here, which may have to do with control systems. As I mentioned before, a very, very large area in the left cerebellum. Notable here is that an area that typically shows up in speech processing models, which are really well established, both for speech perception and speech production. We show no difference at all here, and a very little bit here. And nothing much here either. And these regions, these parts show up in the speech processing models, but also these parts and here show up in the speech processing models. So there's something going on with speech processing that's different in the pundits than in normal, what we call free speech. And then just to go into the depths of this slightly, you'll see, as I mentioned previously, that those differences are very surface, because as soon as you go in, these differences disappear. So they're not in the deep gray matter of the left hemisphere much at all. Of course, when you get in here, that's a different story. And then, as I mentioned previously, you see these very, very large anterior cingulate frontal region differences, and also this precuneus area, which shows up consistently in meditation studies. Right hemisphere gray matter density differences between the pundits and the controls. We see on the surface here virtually nothing. You think, oh, there's not much going on in the right hemisphere, but that's at the surface. There is something here in the right temporal region. But then if you go into the depths of the right hemisphere, you start to see this very, very dramatic difference. So there's a huge amount of the deep right temporal region, and a whole bunch of other areas which are detailed on the slide there, the posterior medial insula, the operculum, and so on. And you also see in the right temporal lobe also a very large area, and again also in the right cerebellum a very large area of difference, some in the prefrontal cortex as well. And then if you go a bit deeper, you see the pattern changes. It goes deeper and deeper. And then again, you see something remarkably similar to the left hemisphere, where you see this enormous difference in the anterior cingulate and prefrontal region there. And again in the precuneus, again that area that's related to meditation.
The human brain has this unique feature, unique quality, veritable nature that we say, and it's called as neural plasticity. Any experience changes, has the ability to change our human brain both structurally and functionally. Dr. James Hartzell, through his work, beautifully highlighted this point that the Vedic priests differed in their structure of the brain, perhaps due to this extensive training in the Vedic texts and unusual verbal memory that they have. We need to understand further about this unique feature of the human brain. And definitely, as Dr. James mentioned, that there's a lot more research that needs to be done to understand these benefits of having learned these texts, and what more research can happen in to be able to understand the benefits of learning these texts. We have with us Dr. Macheri Keshavan. He's a leading psychiatrist, neuroscientist, an expert in the Bhagavad-Gita and its teachings and the Hindu scriptures. He will take us through this concept of neural plasticity and highlight how learning the mantras and other Vedic texts would engage this unique feature of the human brain, the neural plasticity.
Hi, my name is Macheri Keshavan. I'm a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. Today I'll tell you about brain plasticity, which is a remarkable property of the brain to learn from experience, and doing so by building itself, and as you will see in this slide, to sculpt itself or mold itself, which is why the term plasticity is used for this particular aspect of brain function. Let me explain to you a little bit about how brain plasticity works. Plasticity is based on the concept that neurons, nerve cells, when they repetitively fire together, they actually wire together. As you see here, when one neuron connects to the other neuron, and if it does that repeatedly, that particular connection tends to strengthen. And as you see here, as it strengthens, the activity, the electrical activity of that neuron begins to get larger, and that is called long-term potentiation, the fundamental property behind neuroplasticity. So the other important thing to know is that in doing so, the neurons build themselves, which is similar to like building a muscle. As you exercise those muscles more, the muscles get better and stronger. The other important aspect of plasticity I want to tell you is that as we get older, plasticity diminishes to a certain extent. It's highest in childhood, even though we continue to retain some level of brain plasticity throughout life. Now, how can we enhance brain plasticity? What is it that one can do in order to stimulate those neurons to sync together in a way that stimulates the pleasure centers of the brain together, and for a cause that is higher or larger than themselves? Our ancient rishis figured this out and developed mantras. And there are three aspects to the mantras. Number one, they are repetitive. Number two, they are engaging because they are musical. And thirdly, they have profound meanings that take us to levels that are higher than our individual selves. So repetition, engaging, and meaningful. These are the principles that enhance neuroplasticity. So it's logical, therefore, that their regular practice, the regular practice of mantras, is good for the brain and can potentially build their capacity and their resilience. The other important aspect of plasticity is also to note, as you see in this slide, that the musical mantras may also engage both the intellectual as well as the emotional parts of our brain together, leading to an integration that is the central principle behind yoga, as you would have heard from Dr. Gangadhar in another part of this documentary. We all know that many emotional disorders are due to unrestrained activity of those limbic or emotional brain regions. Regularly practicing mantras are therefore likely to enhance positive mental health and resilience. My last point, as I said before, is that brain plasticity is at its highest in childhood and teenage years. It is therefore logical that training the young brain, beginning in childhood, and enhancing plasticity using mantras and scriptures and the teachings in the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad-Gita may have a tremendous value that lasts a lifetime. Thank you.
गातुं यज्ञपतये दैवी स्वस्तिरस्तु नः स्वस्तिर्मानुषेभ्यः ऊर्ध्वं जिगातु भेषजं शन्नो अस्तु द्विपदे शञ्चतुष्पदे ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः ॐ सहस्रशीर्षा पुरुषः सहस्राक्षः सहस्रपात् स भूमिं विश्वतो वृत्वा अत्युत्तिष्ठद्दशाङ्गुलं पुरुष एवेदं सर्वं यद्भूतैच्छभव्यम् उथामृतत्वस्येषाडः यदन्येनातिरोहति एतावानस्य महिमा अतोऽज्यायागुश्च पुरुषः.
We heard a young child reciting the Purusha Sukta. The child may not know the meaning of it yet, but I am sure if we teach these Vedic texts, the Bhagavad-Gita and other texts, I am sure over time the child with this rich fund of memory already that is there would at some point try to seek the meaning of it. Yes, it is unfortunate, as Dr. James Hartzell mentioned, many Vedic priests or Pandits may not know the actual meaning of the text itself. And as Dr. Kashyap highlighted, the traditional Sanskrit that we know that are there in the Vedas are quite different from the modern Sanskrit language that we know of. So there is symbolic meaning that one has to seek and one has to understand. Nevertheless, it is an area that needs to be explored and to be understood. As we know, messages such as an example that I can give, Ano Bhadra Kritavo Yantu Vishwataha. May good thoughts, knowledge come to me from all directions. So there is no barrier in getting knowledge from any direction. There are innumerable Shanti Mantras that are there in these texts. Shanti Mantras are the ones seeking peace, not just for oneself, but for every being in the universe. So it's one of the principles of positive mental health that we know, to think positively not just for oneself and have this unconditional empathy for another being, not just other human beings but other beings in the universe. And another important thing is to be able to balance our emotion, to not just get carried away either by positive emotion or negative emotion. So all these texts highlight the fact that there is life beyond just the mundane upheavals and be able to face any challenges that come our way in our life. So let's take through these experts that we have in the panel and gather their perspective on what is the take home message and what are the benefits of learning these Vedic texts, and the importance of these in both in children from a developmental perspective and also from the clinical perspective. Dr. B.N. Gangadhar, who is a leading psychiatrist, director at NIMHANS, will also take us through the scientific work that they've carried on Om chanting. And as we know, all these Vedic mantras start with Om, end with Om, as I said, is rich with the Shanti Mantras. So let us now move gear slightly differently to understand specifically what are the benefits of learning these Vedic texts. Yes, many could be speculation, but these are the areas where further research needs to be carried out.
And therefore, what are the essential teachings of these 20,000 verses? Most important teaching is there is one superpower, as it were, which cannot be named, which cannot be described, which is only described as that one, tat ekam. It is you called as a neuter gender. It permeates everything. It permeates the leaf, all the animals, the human beings, and everything. It permeates them and energizes them. Remember, at the same time, no two human beings are alike, no two leaves are alike. The same idea. Remember, it is not a monotheism. No, there is not one God here, because aspects of that one are called as devas, that so-called cosmic powers named as Agni, Indra, Soma, etc. And therefore, you may say, what is the purpose of our that one? Therefore, I use the word supreme power, but you have to understand it is beyond description. It is same as the Brahman of the Upanishad. Okay. The purpose is to take all human beings and all animals into higher and higher levels of consciousness. Therefore, they can observe the harmony and beauty in all things of the nature. So automatically, as a small corollary, the idea that this earth doesn't belong to human beings. The earth belongs to all the living beings, and human being has no right to kill anything at all. Therefore, the idea always is, just as we get milk from the cow without harming it, we should also get all we want from the earth without harming it, without dumping into it all our garbage and this and that and that. And therefore, and of course, you may say, are you not aware of all the world wars? Yes, Veda recognizes the existence of the negative powers of also. The way Agni, the positive powers I have mentioned, Agni, Indra, Soma. We don't mention the names always, therefore we put a collective. It's called Vishwe Deva, the collective of all the Devas. Therefore, opposite to it, there is another group known as the Dasyus. Das means to cut. Therefore, their idea is to destroy everything. You is to seek. They seek to cut and destroy everything. They are called the Dasyus. Therefore, the Dasyus, they are not again just as our Agni, Indra, or non-physical thing. They don't have physical body, but they have power, and they don't separate what we call as non-physical bodies. Similarly, the Dasyus also have non-physical bodies. And therefore, the people all of us have heard of the so-called the five enemies: anger, krodha, greed, lobha, delusion, moha, super aggressiveness, mada, and jealousy, matsarya. These are all found both in the Rig Veda and the Yajurveda. And human beings who come under the negative forces via these five negative forces are what we call the bad people. They are the people who start the world wars and everything else. And of course, the idea is supreme power does control them. Whatever negative powers, Supreme tolerates them because human beings cannot have sustained happiness all the time. We need problems and corresponding pain, because Aurobindo says pain is the hammer of the gods to beat the dead resistance in the mortal heart. Therefore, what does he do? He uses all those things for the positive purpose. Second World War was bad, at least some 70 million people died. But at the same time, it resulted in the end of the colonial powers, England, France, etc. At least it would not have happened. Before the war, England was considered the Britannia who rules the seas and that sort of thing. Similarly, same thing for the endemic COVID we are having. Before the endemic, all the Western people thought they had the best medicine system. They said, how many hospitals you have? But Indians said, no, thank you. But now, what is the status? Idea, if you count the number of millions per million, number one country is United States and number two is the United Kingdom. That is this idea. India is much, much below. So argument is that what the Supreme wants to state is, it wants to bring in the idea of humility to all of these people, limitations of the knowledge. So as I told you, first thing is, of course, we have to treat everything as alike. Second point is, you want prosperity for yourself. That's very good. At the same time, also think of prosperity for all, human beings and others, and non-harm for none. Therefore, whenever we have a prayer, saying, oh, the Supreme Power, give it to me, I say, oh, Supreme Power, give it to all of us. We use the word plural, daha, and that's the idea. The third thing that sort of our Veda want to teach really is, this idea is, we all of us, in the modern times, what we call as computer, it has only generated data and data. Very, very useful also, but not knowledge. Knowledge goes with wisdom. Understand a deeper value of knowledge also. That is how it can benefit so many people in so many ways. Therefore, we call it as, as a matter of fact, the Indus Valley civilization. So it was there, they found out even as early as 2500 BCE, they already had good sanitation systems and drainage systems. Remember, in Europe, they came only after 1600 CE, the current era. Therefore, the Veda basically says that this understand the diversity of everything. Each one is different and each one has a play in this universe. So recognize the diversity and try to bring about the harmony. Veda says, don't ever think of as governing only by means of majority. Therefore, it has so many types of things. It says, try to see in your own small committees, in the Veda, there is no such thing as what is called autocracy. Even it is not there in Indian kingdoms. It is not there in Indian kingdoms also, The king controlled only the part, the villagers and the guilds, they controlled everything else. So the purpose of all of this Veda is to, in some sense, develop the idea of, shall we say, harmonious living. Instead of majority putting their ideas on a minority or vice versa, why don't you develop a method by which you can have, in some sense, common governance, common way of, shall we say, where we differ, but we accept how things can be done, this sort of a thing. I was asked, what are the essential things that people should take home from this talk? First thing is importance of the oral culture for all people, number one. Number two, the world earth is not owned by human beings. It is owned by all living beings also. Number three, there is enough to satisfy the needs of all, but not the greeds of the many. Only that is the third. And the fourth one, of course, is we should think of the, and people ask the question, how do we get this knowledge? The idea is there is no barrier between humans and the supreme power. When we utter a mantra for Agni or Indra, his power manifests within us, and that empowers our hands and legs and mouth and everything else to do work better and better and better. Therefore, there is no harm, that is a hard bifurcation between the Deva and human beings and that sort of thing. Therefore, why we do pray? We pray only because, oh, Supreme Power, establish the harmony in us. How do we establish? In some sense, we speak of the good words. Bhadram karnebihi shunyama deva. May we always utter and hear only what we call as harmonious words. I am reciting a mantra from the Rig Veda, first mandala, 89 Sukta, second mantra. Bhadram Pashyema. Let us always look at things positively and express them. And always think of our health also, completely our health. The idea is don't think health is because absence of disease. Our body is a super perfect mechanism designed so that if you take care of its little bit of food correctly, achara, and thinking, vichara, and entertainment, vihara, then automatically you will be happy and creative all of your life. There is something called as immunity which protects you. There are, of course, the bacteria is there. The bacteria harms you only when you weaken your body by bad thoughts and bad actions. Therefore, immunity is there. You weaken the immunity, then there is a disease. Therefore, they don't blame the sort of bacteria for them. Blame yourself for not obeying the things. Like this, in every aspect of life, the great contribution of Veda is don't make separate partitions. Education is separate, health is separate, profession is separate. Make sure in everything you include everything else. This is what is called as the integral presentation of the life and the world. Similarly, we don't have to sort of start unnecessarily wars and that sort of thing. But the idea is the protection is also necessary. That's the point Veda, as Bhagavad-Gita, as Krishna said in Bhagavad-Gita, same idea is there. Therefore, it says, Veda basically says the same thing in a different, very interesting way. We often take credit for things we don't really do. For example, a lady cooks a beautiful sambar. Oh, it is my recipe, she says. But how did the various vegetables combine together to give the perfect, peculiar taste of that day's sambar? Therefore, it is the main powers called Agni, Indra, etc., Agni, water, which create the taste of the food. Human contribution is very little in everything. Even in my own speech, what is human contribution? 0.1%. The divine contribution, 99.9%. Then once you realize that, we understand the idea of Gita, don't claim any results for your actions. You do it because doing action itself gives you great pleasure. It is what is called the joy of work. The benefit, like, after all, when I cook the food, I only eat it. Nobody else comes and eat it. So that's the minor point. But the idea is, the basic idea is, share everything, all you have, not only with human beings, but with other things also. Therefore, I tell people, the take home for today is, now the question is, the Veda always says, your human life is limited to, let us say, when I 50 years, 60 years. You can't learn everything in one birth. Therefore, necessity of a rebirth, only including adding to our load of experience in world by world. Rebirth. This idea is there in the Veda. First mandala, 140th Sukta, 12th mantra. 12th mantra. Our 12th mantra, it basically says our life, our body is not simply a home, but we are traveling by different boats, different ships in different berths. Therefore, in each berth we add on. Therefore, there is continuous living from day to day, accumulate. That's how we see our Ramanujans and our Einsteins, because they had worked for all of it in so many different earlier lives they had put, and they got that result. So, summing up, these Vedas we should learn, not because in some sense we can get the benefit of the cosmic powers simply by sincerely reciting the Vedas. We get their memory, we get supreme knowledge, and that knowledge continues every day. And it is because of the Vedic culture, is only in India we have books on everything. Earliest books on the elephants or the horses or the cows or the plants, they all came from India only, not from anywhere. Not I leave out of mathematics and science, that's a different question. You are here, there also have taught decimals came only from India. In the Yajurveda, we recite all the digits from 1 to some the millions and millions and that sort of thing. Therefore, the idea is the same, and also as I told you, if only you pay attention, ladies pay attention to memorization of the recitation of the songs, it falls on the children's ears and it is almost on the mantras. Therefore, automatically they get access to this without much sort of forcing at all. Therefore, the Veda is an all-sided method for all-sided education for all people, not just Brahmins, for everybody. Many of the rishis were not born as Brahmins at all, like Ailusha and that sort of.
Amongst the several philosophies that India has given to the humanity is the Yoga Darshana. Yoga is a tradition which has brought about a remarkable change in the present day world. And no wonder it was given a very formal position by the United Nations in 2015. The International Day of Yoga is being observed on June 21st, year after year. The tradition of yoga involves not merely those postures, what we do, it's more than that. In fact, the word of yoga comes from yuj, which means connecting my personal consciousness to that cosmic consciousness. This transcendence is what is yoga. But how does this happen? Is this a mere mental effort, or is it a biological change that all these processes bring in to make my mind calmer and help me in that transcendence which I achieve? There are several yoga concepts which have now become applicable in clinical practice, though most of us could be practicing it as a lifestyle. Some parts of yoga, if not all parts of yoga. Yogic traditions include postures, breathing, mindfulness, and a set of morals that we are expected to follow. Amongst the yoga practices, one of them is chanting Om. In fact, there are many other forms of yoga applications which include humming called as Brahmari. But Om is a chant which is usually linked to all yoga modules, either at the time of beginning or at the time of closing the session. We were excited to see what this Om can do to us. And one of that which we realized was that it had a significant effect on the brain physiology. Once a person chants Om, some of the nuclei in the brain called as the limbic nuclei actually become deactivated. One would always be surprised why would a yogic practice actually deactivate any business in the brain. And these are the centers which are linked to emotions. These are the centers, when they are active, make the emotions heightened: depression, anxiety, anger, and so on. And there is no surprise that most people who chanted the Om said they felt calmer, and that's precisely what the brain physiology is also telling us, that when you chant Om, the limbic nuclei actually become deactivated. They function less. And how does this happen, and how did we measure it? This happens because of an effect which the Om produces through the signals which are sent to the brain through what we may call as the auricular branch of the vagus nerve. When I chant Om, I experience a sense of vibrations around my ears, and my ears are also supplied by this vagal nerve, the sensory information which is carried through the vagus and would possibly be making this change in the brain. This is, of course, a theorization which we have built after having detected what we call as the deactivation, which today is measurable by a very sophisticated procedure called as the functional magnetic resonance imaging. So yoga practices, this is one example. There are many other examples wherein the Vedic tradition has influenced the yoga. The chanting of Om is also broken into A, U, All these chanting in this way actually also produces vagal afferent stimulation through the larynx and through, of course, the auricular branch of the vagus nerve. Several yogic procedures could also have the same influence, particularly the Kapalabhati, when you deep expirations very vigorously and also very frequently done. In very quick succession when we do, we probably could be stimulating several vagal afferent branches in my chest as well. So together, one of the traditions of the yoga could be acting on the brain by this way, the vagal afferent stimulation to my brain. There are many other ways in which one could imagine that the yoga would be working, which would be setting right the networks in the brain. My brain is not a mere matter from where the signals come out, but my brain could be a more intelligent chip which actually has connections within, and these connections as a net would produce a functional behavioral effect that what we see. And these networks, one of the commonly investigated network is the default mode network. In some conditions such as schizophrenia, the default mode network has been found to be less coherent. And we were able to demonstrate that you practice yoga, the schizophrenia individual actually gets better, but the networks in the brain for the default mode network becomes more coherent. In fact, these changes in an individual with the practice of yoga asanas, some of the pranayama procedures have also been demonstrated to produce significant clinical improvement in patients of conditions like schizophrenia. People are able to feel a change within themselves. Others are also able to see a change in this individual. The individual who was not in a position to recognize emotions in others, he was very indifferent to others. He is now able to recognize emotions, empathize, and emote with them. There could be several other benefits that we have been able to demonstrate, but suffice to say, one of the traditions of Indian philosophy, such as the yoga tradition, can bring about significant effects in the individual's behavior, and thanks to the technology and science, we are able to actually even measure them with these modern technologies and gadgets. Technology demonstrating that these traditions work on us and produce a change is one component of the evidence that we are able to bring about, but more importantly, the experience that the individuals report while practicing these things is even more significant. A teenage girl said, "Why are you practicing yoga?" When I asked her this question, I saw a lot of yoga gurus in her photos in her house, yoga postures in her study room, and I was a little surprised why a teenager could have all these things in her room. And I asked her, "No, uncle, the yoga makes me feel connected." "What do you mean feel connected?" She said that while I am learning yoga over these days and months, I am able to experience that I am connecting with people with whom I am doing yoga, with my family members, with the society. When I come out, I feel that all the people are somehow connected. I am not alone in this world. I feel a sense of reassurance and confidence while I am in the society. Yoga actually makes this society Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, an entire family which is connected. That is what is yoga brings about, and that actually makes sense when I am able to connect and transcend, connecting myself, personal consciousness, to that cosmic consciousness. Why should not I connect to other people neighborhood? And so I believe there is a reason to believe that yoga effects, which may appear spiritual, would be initially bringing about a change within the society, within the people who are all doing yoga. And no wonder yoga connected all countries, and all countries did the International Day of Yoga celebration by doing mass yoga across continents, across states, across cities. Hundreds of people gathered in the fields, did yoga together. This togetherness is some phenomenon which today we are able to measure by way of the effects of yoga on mirror neurons, effects of yoga on social cognition in healthy individuals, and also those individuals with deranged functions in these areas. So together, some of the traditions which we are able to examine today, the Indian traditions, the Vedic traditions, today are examinable by scientific approaches, both in clinical population, in healthy subjects, in their physiology, and also in their behavior.
Keshavan sir, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the later texts, the Bhagavad-Gita, all have a common theme in them. One is to do with spirituality, and more from a psychologist's point of view or a psychiatrist's point of view, there is a lot of message that is common across these texts that have to do with spirituality, to do with principles of positive mental health, and also by learning these texts, there should be some neurobiological benefits. If you could take us through these messages that are there, a common thread that is existing amongst all these texts of the scriptures that we discussed, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad-Gita, and other texts, it would be great.
Thank you for those questions, Shantala. I would like the first slide, if you could share it.
Yes.
Which will help me kind of bring to the front the importance of the concept of the mind in these ancient scriptures of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad-Gita. It is good to point out that the mind and its unity with the body and the spirit was probably first described anywhere in the world by the Upanishads. In the Katha Upanishad, the mind and the sensations and the reason or intellect have been identified as being part of one whole entity. And this has been compared to a chariot. So in the Katha Upanishad, it is said that the horses are of this chariot are like the sensations that are constantly distracting us and bombarding us with sensory inputs. The mind or the manas are like the emotions which are constantly driven by these sensations. So if the sensations are like the horses and the horse is drawing the chariot in whatever direction that are, that these horses desire to go, but there is the charioteer who controls these horses through his reins. So there is the reasoning part of the mind, which is the buddhi, which controls the lower part of the mind, which is the manas or the emotions, by these reins, which control in turn the horses, which are the indriyas or the sensations. Around the same time as when the Katha Upanishad was composed, in Greece, Plato was writing on a similar metaphor with the chariot, with the reason and the emotion and the desire all being part of the same. Again, the main point here is that we have a lower brain which is driven by emotions and the desire, and a higher brain, higher mind, which is the reasoning part of the mind. In the Upanishads, there is a distinction made between the charioteer, which is the reasoning part of the mind, and the rider of the chariot, which is the soul or the Atma. So many people do make that distinction, and scientists don't exactly make that distinction and are agnostic to that distinction between the spirit and the intellect. So if we move to the next slide, how do we put the brain into this context? The way our brain is organized, we have a lower brain and a higher brain. The lower brain, which we call the limbic system, is what governs our emotions. And our emotions are driven by our sensory inputs, as you see here. But then the emotions themselves are regulated by the higher cortical brain. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that regulates the lower brain regions like the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which are what account for our emotions. We need emotions and we need reasoning, but they have to be balanced between each other. And that's a critical piece. Next slide, please. So Bhagavad-Gita really took this point really a further step. As you all know, the Bhagavad-Gita is a story. And it's a story within a story of the warrior Arjuna, who is in the middle of a war between cousins, which is about to start. And he develops a panic attack because his mind is astray and he is confused as to what he should do. Because on the one hand, if he wins, he becomes the king. But if on the other hand, he might lose, and also he might have his own cousins and relatives and other family members dying and so forth. He doesn't know what to do. He's confused, and the reasoning part of his brain has kind of felt paralyzed, and the emotions are going all over the place. And that is when Krishna, the charioteer, really counsels him and really takes the approach like a teacher teaching a student as to how the mind works. What is the mind? Who are we? What is the ego? What is intelligence? What is the right thing to do? What's the right way to make a decision, and so forth. So many pearls of wisdom that come from the Bhagavad-Gita are in those 18 chapters, which I won't go into the details, but I want to talk about the fundamental concepts. Since this is a session about the brain, I want to talk a little bit about how Krishna teaches Arjuna to take control of the reasoning part of his mind. And if you go to the next slide, he talks about how negative emotions happen to us. The Bhagavad Gita, Krishna points out that we are constantly driven by action that is directed towards some extrinsic goals. We always want to do something because there is something in it for us. And as we keep doing that, we get into a kind of a cycle. Action leads to rewards, or action leads to what is called phala. And so one becomes oriented as you keep moving the slide forward. One gets into kind of a vicious cycle of having to keep doing the same thing in order to produce some result or the other. And then you have to do more of the same thing in order to get those kind of results. So you become dependent on the results. And having done that, that leads to attachment or craving, which is the source of negative emotions, as you will see there in the next part of that slide.
Similar to the concept of Sangasteshu Pajayate, Sangat Sanjayate.
Exactly. So what Krishna is saying here is that, the Sangha, which is the attachment, is what leads to the negative emotions. Sangat sanjayate kamaha, kamat krodho vijayate, krodat bhavati sammoha, sammohat smriti vibhrama, smriti bhramshat buddhinasho, buddhinashat pranashyati. Just the point is, kama, krodha, lobha, moha, mada, and matsarya, which are the 6 negative emotions. If you are craving for something and you don't get it, you get depressed. If you're craving for something and you're afraid you won't get it, that leads to anxiety or fear. If you're craving for something and somebody else gets it, you get angry. If you own something and you think only you own it, that is pride. And if somebody else owns it, you become jealous. And similarly, lusting. These are all negative emotions. And this is the root cause of negative emotions, according to the Bhagavad-Gita. If you go to the next slide, the Bhagavad-Gita offers a solution for this, and that is to help the individual to uncouple one's actions from extrinsic rewards, extrinsic motivations, like getting a prize or getting money, getting a bigger paycheck, and so forth. If one focuses not on those, and thereby avoid negative emotions, but focuses on the kinds of actions that are for a higher purpose, what in Bhagavad Gita is called Loka Sangraham. And then one's actions, if they are driven by what one is particularly good at and what one's own best strengths are, that is called Kaushalam. Yogaha Karmasu Kaushalam. If you are good at something, do that to your perfection. And that is what yoga says. At the same time, when you are engaged in action, it's important that you have strike the right balance of not doing too much or too little, but strike the balance of what you are doing at your best strength and abilities. These principles, which together are called by the modern psychologists as intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation, are what lead to a sustained state of positive mental health. And also a positive mental health that is independent of external rewards, which is why the principles, as you'll see in the next part of your slide, this slide, it is the unattached action or nishkama karma leads to both sustained positive emotions that are intrinsically driven. Atmanyev atmana tushtaha. One can therefore be happy within oneself and not necessarily have to depend on external happenings. And that is autonomous. You train yourself to be happy irrespective of the external sources of happiness. Now, let me talk a little bit more about emotions and how they are constructed. Our brain is wired in such a way that we have a somatic nervous system which makes us speak and makes us move our limbs and makes us get their sensations and so forth. We all have that, and that is how we are able to walk and talk and do our day-to-day things. We also have another part of the nervous system which is not under conscious control, unlike the somatic nervous system, which is under our own voluntary control. Now, when we speak, when we walk around, which is under our own volition. But there are other parts of the nervous system, which is called the autonomous nervous system. It's called autonomic nervous system because it is autonomous from the higher brain. It operates underneath the surface. And there are two parts to that. They are constantly balancing each other. One part of it is what is called the sympathetic nervous system, which the brain uses for the purpose of fight, flight, or fright. In emergency situations, you have to pour out the adrenaline and run from danger, or fight if need be, and that is what is called the sympathetic nervous system. By contrast to that, we have another part of this autonomic nervous system, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, which comes into play when we are resting, when we are rebuilding, when we are digesting. So they are the yin and yang of the brain, and they have to constantly be balancing each other. So that balance is very important, as you'll see in the next part of this slide. And if the balance is off, and if the sympathetic nervous system becomes overactivated, that is what leads to negative emotions like anxiety and depression and so forth. This is where yoga comes into the picture. Yoga is, by its Sanskrit meaning, it stands for yuj, which means yoke. Yoke of like a chariot. We started off with a chariot metaphor, and the chariot has to be balanced, and that requires a balance between the opposing reins of those horses, and that requires yoga, which is an approach that has been constructed over thousands of years to help our brain to balance the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems.
And in a way, this is considered as a way of life.
Yes, absolutely.
In the traditional method of teaching and learning, yoga is a way of life.
Absolutely. So if you go to the next slide, you kind of read my mind. The first part of the yoga is actually to discipline one's own life, to know what is the right thing to do and what's not the right thing to do, which are called the yamas and the niyamas, the do's and the don'ts. And having done that, it doesn't necessarily have to be in that order, but there is the component of training our somatic nervous system by regulating our motor system, learning to balance, learning the right kind of coordination of our movements, which require body postures and exercises and so forth, which are the asanas. And then there is the regulation of our autonomic nervous system, which is not under our conscious control. And yoga has a built-in way of helping us taking control of our autonomic nervous system by breathing exercises, which are also called pranayama, and regulating desires, like regulating those reins in that chariot, the horses and the reins. That is called pratyahara, which is very important for us to regulate how much sensational input that we put into our brains. And having done that, we need to train that brain. The brain training could go stepwise with training the emotional part of the brain by the initial step of 1-point meditation, also called dharana. And then as we become good at that, one could go to the next step of reflective contemplative meditation, which helps us to understand, or for the observing part of the brain to observe the lower emotions as they ebb and flow. And that ability of the observer to observe the mental activity without making a judgment is called dhyana. So it's really important. This kind of a mindful meditation, reflective meditation, is very important for training or gaining control of the higher intellectual brain, which is called buddhi. And then there is a even higher level of enlightenment, even a deeper stage of meditation, which some people experience, not everybody does, where one experiences a unity between oneself and the world. That kind of a experience of oneness is called samadhi, the highest stage of meditation, where people talk about spiritual enlightenment. These 8 steps were articulated by Patanjali going back 2000 years ago, and really represent a comprehensive stepwise approach to regulating our body, our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, and the emotional and the intellectual parts of our brain, which is a really comprehensive, beautifully constructed approach to improve our own health, whether it is physical, psychological, as well as spiritual. Next slide.
So, spirituality also, although it's the common thread, the byproduct of this exercise towards the higher spiritual pursuit becomes mental health, the positive mental health that today we talk about in the current psychological realm.
Absolutely. And, there is no mental health without physical health. There's no physical health without mental health. And so this is something that our ancient rishis discovered thousands of years ago. And so their approach is very, very integrated, which is far ahead of what the world saw for many more thousands of years to come. So, and the mental and physical health are critical for spiritual health as well. And by the spiritual health, I mean having a compass to know where we are headed. If we are our body is the chariot. That chariot needs a direction. Spirituality is what gives that direction. Simply having the horses under control by the charioteer is insufficient, but the charioteer needs to have a compass as to where to go. And that is what spirituality offers.
Mm-hmm. And in the jargon that is used in these scriptures, the samskaras that happens on the human mind or the soul, a parallel to that would be the impressions that we say in the current neuroscience perspective, the neural plasticity. Because by doing these exercises, in turn, the environment changes the physiology, the structure, and the functioning of the human brain. And that becomes the way of action, that becomes the way of our behavior in future.
Right. So all of these practices, inevitably have their effect on the brain. And the brain is not like a regular computer. Many people simply think of brain like a computer. But brain, unlike a computer, is a self-regulating, self-evolving computer. But there are no such computers in the world other than the human brain. And how does it do that? How does the brain build itself and repair itself and change itself? And that is through this principle of neuroplasticity, which I think I have talked about in the other part of this.
Sure.
I just want to close with some thoughts and some of my views on the work that we did and where it fits into the broader history of the Sanskrit and Vedic tradition, and where it fits into the scientific tradition, which is a 21st century reality. Modern science really only started a few hundred years ago, so it's really new on the block in terms of human knowledge systems. So some interesting things to me. The Vedas, we know for sure, when we talk about the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda to that extent, they're about 3,500 years old. So that's 3,500 years. That's a really long time ago. And there's a number of things about that. First of all, this long precedes modern science, obviously. It long precedes modern politics. And I do have to say I've been very disappointed to hear that some people have been trying to use this study for political purposes. That, to me, is just totally wrong. And the other thing that's incredibly interesting is if you look at the history of human language systems, human language knowledge systems from China and the Middle East and South Asia and European systems and even Western Hemisphere systems, I have not been able to find another textual tradition where the actual pronunciation of the texts from 3,500 years ago has been preserved in the precise, continuous manner that the Vedic tradition has done. This seems to be unique in the world. I'm not sure. Maybe someone will prove me wrong. But it's a remarkable thing in any case, even if it isn't unique, because what it means is we know how to pronounce the Vedas pretty much the same way they were pronounced 3,500 years ago. That's kind of astonishing, because languages generally change a lot over time and over the centuries. And in fact, the reason Panini did what he did with the Paninian grammar was precisely to kind of capture the language before it changed too much from the Vedas. And then that gave us classical Sanskrit, which has also been quite continuous in that sense. Most languages, you can't go and read a text from 2,000, 3,000 years ago and know how to pronounce it. It just is impossible because the pronunciation has been lost, whereas the Vedas preserved the sound in addition to the meaning. So then we have to ask scientifically, why would a culture, human culture, and forget about being Indian for the moment, just think in the world you have a human culture which says the sound of these texts is incredibly important. It's so important that we're going to make sure that we never change that sound. And we're going to train our children generation after generation for 3,500 years. That's a really long time. Many generations, a lot of kids getting trained, grow up, become parents themselves and grandparents. They train their own kids and their nieces and their nephews and so on. More nephews traditionally, but anyway. And they say, don't change the sound of these texts. Get this right. Keep it right. We're going to spend hours and hours and days and weeks and months and years training to pronounce this thing correctly. Okay, now scientifically, that's a really interesting question. Why would you do that? Why would anybody ever do that? And that's an enormous amount of effort. So what could possibly be the motivation? Now, scientifically speaking, we have no idea, okay? And anybody who claims we know, scientifically speaking, why they did that, to me, that's speculation, to put it politely. That's really just making stuff up. We don't know because we haven't investigated the question. This research study that we published in Neuroimage was a very big, it was a pretty big, but it was a first step into doing a really proper scientific study of the kind of origins of the Sanskrit tradition, because the Vedas are the oldest text that we have. And what I find really interesting is the following question, and this had to do with the Sanskrit effect blog piece, where again, as I say, we didn't prove the Sanskrit effect, but we raised the question about the Sanskrit effect. The Vedic tradition and the Sanskrit tradition say that mantras have a cognitive, shall we say, cognitive psychophysiological effect on the people who use them. So if you recite Sanskrit, or you think in Sanskrit, or you write in Sanskrit, or you speak Sanskrit, the tradition says Sanskrit is a mantric language. It has this kind of sound pattern built into it. And if you use this mantric language, particularly the Vedic mantras, but also others, it will have a cognitive impact. Now that's true of any language, but the difference is in the Sanskrit tradition is they kept the sound from 3,500 years ago. So they said, not only is that true, which is true of every language, but there's something particular about the kind of sound code of the original Sanskrit that we as a culture and a tradition think is so important, we don't want to change it. And we want to, it's kind of, it might be, I mean, this is where it's really speculative on my part. And if somebody quotes me as saying, we proved this, I will really get upset. What we have is that it's almost like a sound code. It says, all right, we know as a tradition, this is the traditional explanation, not the modern scientific explanation. The traditional explanation says we know as a tradition that this language, this sound patterns, and the meaning encoded in them has a big cognitive impact, which is related to all the yoga traditions and so on, and even the Buddhist tradition and so on. Now, the tradition has an explanation for why this happens, but that's not a modern scientific explanation. So for me, the most interesting scientific question or set of questions that we can get into is to say, all right, let's take the tradition seriously. Let's not assume it's true, but let's take the question seriously and let's investigate the question, which is what we did in a very preliminary way with the neuroimage study. You know, the Vedic tradition keeps these texts recited. So we said, well, let's look at what's going on there in the brain and see if we can see something. So we saw something. So now the question is, well, if there is a real effect of speaking Sanskrit, thinking in Sanskrit, meditating in Sanskrit, reciting Sanskrit, particularly reciting Vedic Sanskrit, if there's a real effect on your cognitive function and your emotional function, your physiological function, your neuroplasticity, your brain structure and function, what is that effect? Is there an effect? And if there is an effect, what is the effect? And to me, this is a really interesting question where if we pursue it scientifically, not politically, not ideologically, not theoretically only, not philosophically, those are all great things. But scientifically, if we go into this and we say, how does this thing actually work? What is actually going on here? Does this really happen? Under what conditions does it happen? Can we compare Vedic recitation to Quranic recitation, to Latin recitation, to Pali recitation from the Buddhist tradition? All of these traditions still exist. Can we compare it to modern Sanskrit poetry, to Kalidasa, to speaking in Sanskrit for half an hour? None of these studies have been done yet. And until they're done, and until the comparisons are done, until the investigation is driven forward scientifically, we won't know the answer to whether there is a Sanskrit effect, and if there is one, what is it? To me, these are very interesting questions, and I thank the organizers for this situation to say, let's think scientifically about these questions, not politically, not ideologically, not philosophically, not mythologically, none of these things. Let's think scientifically about these questions and ask, how can we go about this scientifically and take the research forward, not just talk about only a study that was done already 5 years ago? Anyway, thank you very much.
So if you could take us through how we could take the research forward, the neuroscience research forward in this area, that would be.
Yeah, thank you for that question again. I think what we need is more of a dialogue between practitioners of yoga and neuroscientists and scholars of ancient scriptures. The key point is that, currently, many of them, they all talk different languages. Mm. What we need is a common language. When we are talking about dhyana or mindful meditation, we need to understand what exactly is happening in the brain during dhyana. And there are some ideas that are emerging, but we need to understand them better through the empirical approaches of science. That requires research, and as we talked about, there are many very good ideas out there that yoga, especially if implemented and if the brain is trained using yogic principles from childhood onwards itself, might enhance that ability of the brain to build itself, and the brain and the brain's own wiring diagram can become more resilient to deal with the stresses and strains of modern life. And there is a lot more research that is needed as to how and if yoga and other spiritual practices can actually impact on brain plasticity. How does yoga change brain function if it does? And is it effective throughout life, or is it more effective, especially if these are ingrained into the developing brain during childhood and teenage years? Also, I would say that there are many pearls of wisdom in the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad-Gita and Buddhist scriptures as well, I might say, which emerged, in the context of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad-Gita. All of those, maybe the lessons from all of those scriptures could be harnessed for psychotherapeutic paradigms in modern medicine and psychiatry. What is needed is practitioners of both psychiatric, psychological science, and those who know the yogic and Upanishadic principles, getting together to develop manuals of specific techniques and approaches that could be outlined for different human afflictions, because there is not one approach for everything. And if one reads the Upanishads and the Bhagavad-Gitas, one learns so many different approaches which could be customized and tailored to different human situations. And what is needed is a manualized approach to psychotherapy by using these principles. And of course, simply developing those is not enough. One has to empirically test them, whether they work by comparison to the usual treatments that we apply in clinical practice. I think that is basically my last slide.
Mhm. So one is the application of it in the clinical conditions. And
Right.
the two take-home message that you're sharing is how learning these texts, understanding the meaning of these texts from perhaps a younger age would actually build resilience. And at a neurocognitive level, we are talking about cognitive reserve. The very fact that we have already these skill sets within us to face the real challenges of life and still maintain the best psychological and physical health for an overall growth. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shantala. That was a wonderful presentation showing us how Sanskrit is more than just a means of communication or it has many more functions than being a mode of speaking and understanding another individual. Would you like to say a few closing remarks and then I'll close?
Yeah, I first of all would thank the audience on a Sunday afternoon to be, listening to this program for about 2 hours. That itself shows, gives me a good feedback that the effort put in really reached out and was meaningful. Couple of things like a take-home message we have already shared. The experts have also shared, and I have kind of summarized it. One is there is definitely a need to do scientific research. Unfortunately, sometimes studies are done, media coverage is carried out, but if you look at it scientifically from the current neuroscience or the current science point of view, there will be so many loopholes, and we kind of fail to kind of impress the global audience and convincing that okay, these are the findings, these are the effects of learning these Vedic texts or other spiritual texts and the benefits of those on healthy individuals or children or from a developmental perspective or even elderly. So it cuts across lifespan. So if I look at it, there are layers in which a scientist, any researcher can approach, and it's gold mine. Again, I would like to reiterate this word. It's a huge gold mine. One is to look at the structure itself. Okay, so the pitch, the rhythm. So people have asked whether it's the musical content of these mantras that can have beneficial effects. Could be, because there are a whole lot of research now happening in the area of music and neuroscience, looking at how the auditory processing, how the rhythmic processing engages this motor pathway, how it kind of rewires and helps the brain to be fit. Two is to look at the benefits of learning itself. So having memorizing by rote sometimes. As I said, we need not know the meaning to begin with, but over the time we will explore, having learned something, what does that mean? So from third point is the understanding the meaning of it and looking at the application value. So that's what Dr. Keshan and I discussed a lot in detail about having this reserve, psychological reserve or cognitive reserve that we talk about, which gives a fundamental foundation for any individual to build his resilience. And that's what today, in the current pandemic, first thing we are talking about is mental health issues. So if we already have these skill sets to be able to handle our emotion, to be having this cognitive reserve, I think that's where our research should be taken forward. And so we basically can look at the subject from multidisciplinary perspective. It has to be a teamwork and a lot more research that can be done. So it's a very exciting area. And I'm super excited and I'm thankful to the Center for Soft Power and the organizers for helping me put this together and making this possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shantalaji. I think we have a lot more work that we can do together and understand why humans have so many different languages and what is the relationship between these, not just linguistically, but cognitively. Within India itself, we have so many different languages.
And
And
dialect. And
totally, and dialects too.
yes.
So anyone who is multilingual, I'm sure, especially being in South India, you tend to know at least 3 or 4 additional languages.
Yes.
Typically, we have some experience with the fact that different languages can allow us to experience the same reality in different ways. And of course, these languages contain many idioms shared between them. But also, there are some that are unique. There are different ways of expressing, ways of saying or thinking, which are culturally linked to different languages and maybe unique to a particular culture. James Fratzel, I think, made a remark which stands out in this presentation, and he says that what is great about the Sanskrit tradition is the self-awareness of the interaction of language with cognitive experience, and the rich traditions which explore these many and varied relationships through yoga, Ayurveda, and all our other ancient practices. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. Lots of takeaways, and I'm sure we can absorb them in over the next few days. The recording will be put up on our website, www.softpowermag.com. So anyone who wishes to go back and view the whole session once again. Thank you so much.
So much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.